I just want to start out by saying how glad I'm that you're all here. I don't know if I said that yesterday, but I really appreciate it. Some of you people have been following me here for how many years, and really I appreciate it, because after that heart stuff, I know what they mean by one day at a time, I'll tell you that. So thank you, I didn't want to forget. And somebody asked me about the 9 world wars. I do have a list back there if you want to get it after the lecture. Okay. One and 2 or 3 people asked me to review the lost cause. The lost cause was the myth that the South invented to justify their position in the Civil War. That they didn't start it, slavery didn't start the war, it was kind of a lost cause, but they fought bravely against Northern aggression, correct? And slavery was really a good thing, and it was good for everybody, positive good. So that's where the theory arose that maybe slavery didn't cause the war. And then you had those revisionist historians around the middle of the 20th century who argued that slavery did not cause the war, that there were other factors. Now we're back to square one, saying most historians now slavery caused the war. Is that dark? Could you see that? Yep. All right, that's James Knox Polk, the president. Huh? Could you put the lights down a little bit, Dust? Maybe it's my thing. No. There we go. James Knox Polk he vowed only to serve 1 term because of a political deal, but he was president from March of 1845 to March of 1849. And to show you, I did mention him, I'm going to get back to him in a second. This was the Oregon country, and one of the slogans that Polk used in 1844 when he ran for president against the ill-fated Henry Clay, one of my heroes, was 54-40 or fight. We wanted all of Oregon. This was the Oregon country. Oregon did really well last night, by the way. I was bragging back east about the Pac-12, and am I going to get it jammed down my throat when I go home? But anyway, that's because I don't know. All right, but I know how you can make money in Vegas. Go and bet the opposite way of me. And like Jimmy the Greek, I used to bet the opposite of what he predicted, and I became pretty rich. But anyway, this was the whole Oregon country, and since 1818, we made a deal with England that would be jointly occupied, all the way from 54-40 degrees north latitude, which is the border of Alaska, which at that time we didn't own. We got Alaska in 1867 from Russia by a purchase. But the whole Oregon country was jointly occupied, meaning we could go anywhere and the British or Canadians could go anywhere with equal rights. And you could see this was for many, many years, that the argument, the obvious thing was to split it along the 49th parallel, which had been the border between Canada and the United States from the Lake of the Woods, which is just west of Lake Superior, all the way out to the Rocky Mountains, which for some reason were then called the Stonies, was the 49th parallel. And England for years had been proposing just to draw it out to the 49th all the way to the ocean, and they would take a little part of Vancouver Island. Other than that, it would be anything below the 49th would be ours, above would be theirs. There was a little dispute here who would own that, but when we went to war with Mexico in 1846, England knew that they then had us kind of at a disadvantage. I didn't say, no, I wasn't even, no, they had us at a disadvantage. What? Okay, my name's not Earl. I don't think of those things. But anyway, England then proposed this again, knowing that because we were at war with Mexico, we won't want to risk in any way getting in a war with England over Oregon. And Polk and Congress accepted that deal, and we did get that little disputed area in there. All England asked for was control of all of Vancouver Island. All right, so, but we did get the better part of Oregon at that time, although it turned out British Columbia and all had a lot of great things there too, and eventually there was the Klondike Gold Strike up there. But at the time, it seemed like we got the better of the deal as far as farmland was concerned, and Oregon country was really good farmland. But that was the huge Oregon country, and then, of course, that's James Knox Polk. And I want to just, before I go on to the Civil War causes, this is the point of no return. Was Polk a great president? Under him, directly or indirectly, look what we added to the United States in 4 years. Look, Texas came in partly because he won the election of 1844. Remember, he said he'd annex Texas regardless, and when he won the election, John Tyler, who was still president, then asked Congress to vote annexation, which they did through a joint resolution, very complicated maneuver. But anyway, under Polk, then directly or indirectly, we get all of this. Was he a great president? Like I said yesterday, was he a land-grabbing SOB? Yeah, but he was my land-grabbing SOB. I don't know how you could, unless you happen to be Mexican, I don't know how you could rank Polk as anything but a great president. When I first got out of grad school, and it was a big thing to rank the presidents, he was my number one. And he did a lot of other things, whether you liked it or not. He actually said, I'm going to do 4 major things, and the main one was get California, 5 if you count getting Texas, but Texas was already ours by the time he became president. But he did get California and all of that. I think he was really one of the greatest presidents. He kept his word and only served 1 term, which was amazing. And I'm going to be doing a speech for a fundraiser over at Tamara's Country Club later in the month. But anyway, it's about presidential scandals like Kennedy and Clinton and Roosevelt and all the president. Wait, they're all Democrats. I better put in Harding. Why don't the Republican presidents have scandals? Nobody go out with a Republican. No, that's all right. But no, Harding actually put them all to shame. Harding made Kennedy look like a choir boy. But that's maybe next year I could do presidential scandals. But anyway, Polk. I'm usually asked, did any presidents really have a great marriage and happy, and Ozzie and Harriet, the picket fence, and all that? Yeah, this guy. He became president. He was our youngest president ever elected at that time. He was 49. So he left office when he was 53. His wife was 50. He died 2 months after leaving office. She lived 40-some more years. Sarah Childress Polk. Honest to gosh. As she lived, I think, to be in her 90s, and so another 41 or 2 years. She never left their plantation the rest of her life except to go to church. She wore black and kept black shades on her house in honor of him. 40 years. I'm always asked, how long is your family going to mourn? Now, my wife's here, but my wife and my sons, especially my sons, 40 minutes? Did he leave anything, Mom? Let's get out of here. Let's get on with our lives. Throw the ashes away. Let's go. Time to get on with our lives. All right, but anyway, I won't know and I won't complain. All right, so 54-45, there's the Oregon country. The Mexican War was mainly started when Polk insisted on the Rio Grande as our boundary instead of the Nueces, and Polk started the war. When I first came out here 20-some years ago, I drove east in the valley toward Blythe just to see where everything was, and I noticed I guess it's in India or is it Coachella, there's a street called Polk Street, one of the presidents, and that's in a heavily Hispanic section. No way there should be a Polk Street in a Hispanic section. And for the 22 years I was at COD, I kept moaning about that. Finally, some Hispanic student came up to me and said, "We don't care, why the hell you care?" And I got the hint. But that shouldn't be, man, that shouldn't be. All right. Okay. So anyway, let me real quick, Bill. All right. One last time back to this. We get all of this land in from Mexico, right? So the question is, in 1848, after the war, what are we going to do about slavery out there? Polk's gone. The new president is a guy named Zachary Taylor. But anyway, there were 3 ideas about what to do about slavery, in the new territories. Well, actually 4. The South said you had to allow slavery in the new territories. You had to. The South argued for what was called extension, that slavery was property, slaves were property, and as much as a northerner had a right to bring a horse or a wagon into Utah or New Mexico or whatever, they had the right to bring slaves there. So the South argued for extension, but there were some other arguments. One was abolition. There were a growing number of people in the North and some in the South who favored the abolition of slavery. That meant to get rid of it completely, Don't let it in the territories, but get rid of it in the 15 states, now including Texas, that had it. Now, the South said that everybody in the North was an abolitionist. That's so untrue. Probably 1 or 2% of the people in the North were abolitionists. That's all. And a smaller percentage in the South. Abolitionists were hated, North and South. Why? Well, in the South, for obvious reasons. They wanted to take property off people, abolish slavery. In the North, they were hated because they were looked at as troublemakers. Because the South was the best customer for Northern factory goods and even farm goods. And if the abolitionists kept angering the South, they wouldn't buy Northern products, and that would cost jobs. Plus, in the North, the abolitionists were hated. There were 4 million slaves. What if they were freed and allowed to come north? They would then compete with Northern free labor and drive down a wage scale. So abolitionists were almost as hated in the North as they were in the South. And if you read about mob violence in the mid-19th century, the antebellum years in American history, if you read about mob violence, I'll guarantee you the mobs were formed against two things. Either abolitionists were mobbed, their newspapers were ripped down, their buildings, a couple were even killed. One guy was killed holding his printing press, an abolitionist. And if there was another mob for any other reason, it was against Catholics. Several Catholic churches, more than several, were burned down in Philadelphia alone during this period. So some of the most hated people in the North were the Catholics, mainly Irish at that time, and the abolitionists, okay? It was amazing. In the year of 1846, 5 Catholic churches in Philadelphia, 1846, were burned down by electrical shortages. Accident, okay. But the abolitionists were just as hated as the new coming immigrants who at that time were mainly Irish Catholic. All right, so abolition was not a very popular idea. The myth is these abolitionists were all over the place. They were very powerful. They rarely got more than 2 or 3% of the vote when they ran. I mean, that's Ralph Nader time. Ralph Nader's hardly going to shake up the United States with 1 or 2% of the vote. All right, popular sovereignty. That was another idea that was kicked around, especially beginning in 1848 with the presidential election that year. I'm not going to bore you with the who ran, who won, lost. But in 1848, one of the candidates, the Democrat, a guy named Lewis Cass, if you're interested, who lost, he was an advocate of popular sovereignty. And the Democrats, who were the strongest party at this time, they advocated popular sovereignty right up through the Civil War. Popular sovereignty sounds okay, but it was a lot more complicated than it seemed. Popular sovereignty, if you assumed that slavery was not evil, if you were not morally or religiously or any other way against slavery, it sounded okay. Popular sovereignty said, let the people in each territory decide whether they wanted slavery or not. When Utah was ready to become a state, or Arizona, or Kansas was going to be a big issue, when any of these new territories are ready to become states, let them vote for themselves. Let the people decide for themselves. Do you people in Kansas, do you want slavery? Do you not? Yes, no. Popular sovereignty, the all-American way to do it. You ever hear this line? Take the decision out of the hands of those stupid people in Washington and let it in the hands of the brilliant politicians locally. Okay, we'll leave it at that. But that popular sovereignty, let the people decide, without getting into a doctrinal argument here. The trouble with popular sovereignty was twofold. Sounds great. First of all, the South said that that's not right. You had to allow slavery in a territory. The only place you could abolish slavery is once a territory became a state. And even that was arguable, but it was generally accepted. All right. The other problem is when you hold the vote. For example, there were stages you had to go through most areas to become a state from a territory. You had to go through 3 stages to statehood, except California. We had the golden rule. We had the gold. We didn't go through any of those stages. No, California, right in. Oh, you skip them. That's right. The golden rule. We have the gold. We become a state yesterday. Okay. And that literally happened. California went through no stages. All right, but Jerry Brown pushed us right through. Okay, he was young then, yeah. Hey, Jerry wasn't born '85. Don't worry. All right, So anyway, another problem is when you hold a vote. When you're halfway to statehood, when you have to wait till you're state, you hold it. If you need 60,000 people to become a state, you hold a vote when you have 40, 30, what? So it was not as easy as it seemed. Plus, the South argued popular sovereignty was not right because while a territory was a territory, you had to have slavery. This kind of assumed that you didn't, all right? But the South wasn't going to bite. And the other idea that really became big in the election of 1848 was, the issue was brought up during the Mexican War called non-extension. And this is what was the heart of the Republican Party at first, non-extension, not abolition. The Republican Party is not dreamed of yet, but non-extension said, leave slavery where it is. In the 15 states that had it, that's fine. If they ever want to get rid of it, fine. If they don't, fine. Just let it there. Let it there. But no slavery in any new territories. So there will be no new slave states. You have 15 slave states stretching from Delaware to Texas. That's fine. But that's where it'll stay. It won't go into Kansas. It won't go into Nebraska. It won't go into Utah. It won't go anywhere out there. That's it. Non-extension of slavery. And eventually the Republican Party, which will be created in 1854, the Republican Party grew to be extremely popular, not because they were abolitionists, they were not, but because they were non-extensionists. So what eventually the Republicans pick up is non-extension, the South picks up popular, or the Democrats pick up popular sovereignty. In 1848, in case you're interested, and I hope I'm not blitzing you here, in 1848, the two major parties were the Democrats and the Whigs. Most northern Whigs would become Republicans by Lincoln's time. Lincoln was a Whig. Henry Clay was a Whig. That's W-H-I-G. I used to hate when I gave a test and students would spell it W-I-G. That's on my head, the Whig. No, this is W-H-I-G. If you wonder where the heck they got that name, it was from an English party named the Whigamores. Yeah, okay. So how many people knew that? All right, I knew that in 5th grade. Doesn't every 5th grader know that the Whigamores were a party in England? No. All right, so the abolitionists, fact and fiction, the abolitionists were few in number. They were hated, North and South, even killed North and South. The North hated them because they threatened to disrupt the trade between the North and the South, and also the northern working people were afraid of freed slaves coming up and taking their jobs. All right, so in 1848, we have a big election of what to do about slavery in the territories, but then we're going to get the KansasNebraska Act. There were big arguments in 1850. Let me go back to it. I wasn't going to do it. I can't resist. I'm weak. All right. In 1850, there were big arguments about slavery. Mainly, California should come in as a free state. California was demanding admission to the Union immediately. And the gold strike had been in 1848. The big rush was in 1849. The miners, 49ers, and their daughters, Clementine. In my lifetime, and their daughters, Clementine, were not nuns, if you know what I mean. You know who follows miners and soldiers out west? It ain't the Sisters of the Swish. All right. But anyway, I'm glad we eliminated prostitution in California today. All right. Okay. But anyway, California wanted to be a free state. 100,000 people moved to California in 1849 alone. California was demanding immediate entrance to the Union. We had to do it. So there was a compromise worked out where the South swallowed hard and allowed California to become a free state immediately. California didn't have to go through any of the stages, nothing. It was simply made a state, free state, and the South swallowed hard and got that. But this purple area, the rest of the territory we got from Mexico, that was open to slavery or not slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. So the South at least had a chance in its mind of, especially New Mexico, which was later broken in New Mexico and Arizona. The South felt that they might be able to get slavery at least in New Mexico, maybe even in the southern part of Utah, although you had the Mormons out there and that complicated things, but still the South thought that they had a chance there. And also the South got some other concessions, which I won't bore you with, but what the South had to accept was California as a free state. The South did get the possibility of slavery out there, although not a guarantee. And also the South got a new law passed called the Fugitive Slave Law, a revision of an old fugitive slave law, which at least on paper compelled the North to help the South catch runaway slaves. And the South was very obsessed with the problem of runaway slaves. And a lot of Northern law officials weren't cooperating enough with slave catchers. So the South, as part of the Compromise of 1850, was also given a new fugitive slave law, which supposedly had no loopholes, but that's a long story. All right, but when California came into the Union, and the gold was out there, I'll get back to the Gadsden Purchase in a second. How are we going to get to California? How are we going to make sure California doesn't go independent, doesn't get taken over by England or something? It was so isolated because our frontier line was right here in western Missouri. This whole area out here was basically uninhabited. There was a few Mexican people, a few Indians, but basically that was it. All right, so anyway, how are we going to get to California? We tried wagon trains. Could they get out fast? All right, you could go by ship if you had the money. You could go by Yankee Clipper all the way around South America and up. But if you had that much money, you could afford a trip like that. Why the hell would you go to California? You were probably doing pretty well back east, right? So why, and let's face it, what kind of people came to California? Successful people back east? No. Desperate people who were failures or anything back east, right? Same as, it's the way it is. All right, but your lawyers and your millionaires, they ain't moving. Why? Pretty good back in New York and Maine. Why move to California? But if you're unemployed and desperate, sure. All right, but how are you going to get there? By wagon train, by ship? Some people even took a very risky journey. The quickest way to get there at this time was to get on a ship, go to Panama. There was no Panama Canal, but you could take a wagon across Panama if you didn't get robbed or killed by bandits, get on the other side of Panama and shoot up. That was the fastest way to do it, right? Okay. But the dream was, beginning in 1848, that we would build a transcontinental railroad. Oh, one footnote. Jefferson Davis, who later became president of the Confederacy, he was Secretary of War at this time, and Davis came up with a theory that the best animal to take us across those mountains and deserts were camels. And did you know, that in the 1850s, under the guidance of Jefferson Davis, we had an Army Camel Corps. We did bring camels in from Africa, North Africa, and tried to use them to pull people across. But Americans who were used to oxen and horses were used to whipping, or at least cracking whips. and a camel, if you crack a whip at a camel, that's going to sit and that's it. All right? And trying to budge a camel that decides to sit is like trying to get a Lithuanian out of a bar. It's not going to happen. You're going to sit there, baby. That's it. All right? So anyway, I don't want to tell Lithuanians. Somebody said, how come you made it Irish Catholic women the other day, right? With that joke I told her, hey, every time you have two Irishmen, you're always going to have a fifth, right? You know all those terrible things they say about the Irish, about them being lazy and drinking and all that political animals and all that politically terrible, incorrect stuff? It's true. All right. Don't tell Pat I said that, Kenny. All right. I'll be thrown out of the club. All right. But anyway, camels didn't work. So the dream was to build a transcontinental railroad. And eventually we would. The transcontinental would be completed in 1869, after the Civil War. But now, the question is, it's 1848, 1850s. We want to build a transcontinental railroad. For many, many years, there's only going to be one railroad, one line, right? That's it, one. So, with slavery, north-south, everything turning on slavery, I'm trying to emphasize, are you going to, basically there were two theories. You could build a road from the Chicago-St. Louis area across directly into San Francisco, roughly where I guess Route 40 is today, 70, one of those interstates. 80, what the heck am I saying? Part of 80, all the way into San Francisco, right? Route 80 starts in New York, ends in San Francisco. Starts at the George Washington Bridge, ends at the Bay Bridge. Oh, Scott. Okay, I had friends that made the drive from one to the other. All right, but anyway, could we build it that way? That would make more sense in a sense because San Francisco was the most important city out there, and it was where the gold fields were and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that made sense. But how did the South want the road built? Jefferson Davis was pushing for it as Secretary of War, now called Secretary of Defense. All right, Davis wanted, and the South wanted the road built from New Orleans through Texas, this way into LA, which was being hooked up already by rail to San Francisco. So they wanted to build a railroad so the South would benefit. Many people in the North wanted the railroad built here so the North would benefit, right? And again, is it going to be North? Is it going to be South? Is it going to help the slave people, the free people? Everything's turning on that. It made more sense at the time to build the road this way. Why? Especially when in 1853 we bought this land from Mexico, the last territory we ever added to the contiguous 48 states. In 1853, under President Pierce, whose Secretary of War was Davis, Jefferson Davis, we sent a railroad promoter from the Carolinas named Gadsden to buy this land from Mexico. Even though our relations with Mexico were strained, obviously the war had only ended 5 years earlier, Mexico couldn't understand why we wanted this land. There was absolutely nothing there. And we offered them $10 million. We actually initially offered them $15 million for that, $10 million for that, and $5 million for Baja, California, the lower part. Mexico was a little leery on Baja, and some Americans didn't want to buy the southern part of California. But anyway, we settled on this area for $10 million. And Mexico was just glad to give it to us because they had absolutely no use for that land. And we bought that. Now that seemed to clinch the fact that the railroad would go there because that was flat land. It was easy to build a railroad through there. When you build it up north, there would be the Rockies, the Sierras, everything else. It seemed like it would be better now to build it through the south. And that's why Davis, Southerner from Mississippi, that's why he promoted the Gadsden Purchase. Now this gets very complicated, but there's no way I could skip it. Another reason it seemed like this would be the better route than this was because this brown area here, which eventually became Kansas, Nebraska, that was unorganized territory. Didn't even have a name, nothing. And when you were in an unorganized territory, rather than a territory, like New Mexico, which was already a territory, unorganized territory, the land was not surveyed. And it was a little riskier to go out there. And it was assumed correctly that who would build the railroad? Not the government. Not the government. Ted Cruz is behind this, doesn't want the government. All right, the government wouldn't build a road, private companies would, but here's the joker. The private company or companies that built the railroad, and it's exactly what happened, would be subsidized by guess who? The government. You're darn right. Private enterprise, sir. Yeah, subsidized by Uncle Sammy. All right, what would be the subsidies? Money. You'd be given for every so many hundreds of miles you took the risk of building a railroad through there. You'd get some money, yeah, but you'd also get land grants, usually on alternating sides of the track. You'd get these squares. You'd build 100 miles, you get a big square of land, maybe 60 by 60 by whatever. Then another swat of land. And obviously, if you built the railroad, that land would become very valuable because it'd be right on the what? Railroad. So whoever built the railroad, and it turned out, you would get money, but more importantly, you'd get these land grants. And those land grants would be critical because you controlled the stops on the railroad. So everything was wonderful, but this land was not surveyed. So if you did build a railroad through, say, what is now Kansas out, you'd have to wait to get your land grants. But if you built it here, because Texas was a state, New Mexico was a territory, the land was what? Surveyed. You'd go to California, you'd be all through states, Texas, California, or an organized territory, so you'd get your land grants immediately. And a bird's hand is always worth two in a bush, right? So why take a chance of building up here and maybe get the land grants, maybe, when you built here, and you got them. Because if you didn't get the land grants after every so many 100 miles, hey, I'm not building until I do get it, right? I'm not going to continue. And it would be that simple. So it seemed like the southern route was the route that was going to go. But now, it's 1854. Nothing yet had happened to make the Civil War inevitable. Compromise of 1850 was basically working. Most people call that the finality compromise. It was the final solution to the slavery issue. Nothing was ever going to occur again. We're going to live happily ever after. Stephen Douglas, who had engineered the Compromise of 1850, I think one of the greatest politicians in American history, the little giant who would eventually debate Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and 2 years later run against Lincoln for president. And here's a trivia, Mrs. Lincoln, who was a loony bin, but a lot of prominent men dated her because she was good looking? No. Because she was an nymphomaniac who owned a liquor store? No. Mary Todd had one redeeming feature. She was the richest woman in Missouri. And I don't know who's the richest woman in Missouri today, but whoever she is, tell her I love her. Okay. But anyway, Mary Todd, before she dated Lincoln, had dated Douglas. Douglas is 5'4", Lincoln 6'4". And she could honestly go to the Lincoln-Douglas debate and say, I slept with both of those guys. All right. So there you go. But seriously, Stephen Douglas is from Illinois, where he'd later run against Lincoln for the Senate and beat Lincoln. He wanted the railroad built here for many reasons. First of all, he and his rich wife owned railroad stocks in this area. And they'd be very much increased if we built the railroad that way. If the eastern end, the eastern terminus, as they called it, would be in St. Louis or Chicago, right? Okay. So Douglas says, well, what I'm going to do is propose the KansasNebraska Act of 1854. Probably the worst act in American history, although nobody saw it at the time. This is the act that more than any other causes the Civil War. Up until Douglas got up in May of 1854 and proposed this act, I don't think the Civil War was going to occur. I really, really don't. But why does he propose the KansasNebraska Act? Many reasons. To enrich himself, yes. But he wants the road built this way, which obviously would help his state of Illinois. Coincidentally, he had investments in that area. Yeah, all right, wonderful. A lot of big railroad magnates in that area were giving money to Douglas, which in those days you could do totally legally and totally openly. Now you have to sneak it. But in those days, here you go, Douglas, get me the railroad. Fine. And Douglas proposes the KansasNebraska Act. That would organize this territory, organize all of this brown area, which was unorganized, organize it into two territories initially that would be subdivided, Kansas and Nebraska, hence the KansasNebraska Act. And Douglas proposes this. As soon as those territories are organized, you could survey the land, and then if the railroad goes through there, the railroad company could get its land grants. Everything fair? But it's 1854. So if you organize these two new territories, what's the first question? What about slavery there? And it probably could have existed in Kansas because it existed in Missouri, was a slave state. And Kansas, especially eastern Kansas, had exactly the same climate, topography. Everything else is Missouri, so why not? Well, all right. So the question is, all right, Douglas, what the South, North? All right, we'll go along with that. It'll help the westward movement. We'll organize Kansas, Nebraska. But what about slavery? Well, here's the complicated thing. Since 1820, since the Missouri Compromise, 34 years earlier, slavery was prohibited here. Anything north of the 3630 line, that, if you can't read that in the back, that's the Missouri Compromise line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes. Anything north of that line in the old Louisiana Purchase Zone, and all of that was, there would be no slavery. So if the KansasNebraska Act came down as simply Douglas wanted it, organized Kansas and Nebraska into territories so they could eventually become states, slavery could never exist there because of the 3630 line. So why, oh why, should the South vote for the KansasNebraska Act, which would open up new free territories and set up a competing area for the Southern Railroad route, right? So the South says, Douglas, stick it. We're not going to go for that. And Douglas knows that. So he's going to sweeten the pie. And he doesn't think this is going to cause any trouble. Oh, it did. It caused civil war. Douglas said, all right, we'll organize Kansas and Nebraska, but Congress passed the 3630 line. It was not part of the Constitution. It was just a bill that became a law. We'll repeal it. We'll repeal 3630, and we'll say that Kansas and Nebraska and any other states that are subdivided out of that, they will become states, slave or free, based on popular sovereignty. So the South salivates. They'll get a repeal of 3630, and then slavery might or might not exist in both Kansas and Nebraska. But it might. Prior to the KansasNebraska Act, it wouldn't. You follow me? All right? And the South assumed, and this is not what the Act said, the South assumed Kansas would become a slave state, Nebraska a free state, and Kansas would become a state a lot sooner than Nebraska, so they're going to gain a slave state to counterbalance California that had just come in as a free state. It's not what it said. It said what? Popular sovereignty. But when the KansasNebraska Act is passed, Douglas, in his mind, and he was probably right, not many slaves would be brought out there anyway, so what's the big deal? And that was true. But psychologically, I can't make it any simpler, the northern people go ballistic. They said, this is a treasonous act. You repealed a sacrosanct law. We were told there'd never be slavery there. It was supposed to be kept open for free labor, for free white men. If we want to go out there, we don't want to compete against slave labor. We know that white men get paid less in the South than in the North because there's slavery down there. If we move to Kansas, Nebraska, we don't want slavery out there. And people go ballistic. And what does the KansasNebraska Act do? It repeals the Missouri Compromise. But in the summer of 1854, immediately after the passage of the KansasNebraska, huge rallies all over the North are passed or are held protesting the KansasNebraska. At some of the rallies, this is the God's truth, 15,000 and more people set bonfires and all to protest the repeal of the Missouri Compromise line in the KansasNebraska Act. Imagine getting 15,000 people together in these days was virtually impossible. First of all, you didn't have the stadiums. Second of all, you didn't have the transportation. To get 15,000 people together, I mean, it was almost like getting 150,000 together or more today. I mean, drawing all these farmers and people who had to come miles and miles and miles and give up days and days of work just to go up and protest the KansasNebraska. And, I mean, these rallies were huge, and firebrand speakers get up. And finally, at one of the meetings, ironically, in a place called Jackson, Michigan, Andrew Jackson was the founder of our modern Democratic Party. When in Jackson, Michigan, somebody comes up and says, well, let's form a new party, because the Democrats, they sponsored the dang KansasNebraska Act. Douglas was a Democrat. The Whigs, they're just falling away anyway. They're stupid people. Let's have a new party called the Republicans. Yeah. We'll get Chris Christie to build a bridge to California. All right, so overnight, the Republican Party is created. By the end of 1854, it's a major power. By 1856, the Whigs are virtually gone. The Republicans replaced them in the North. By 1856, the Republicans come in within a whisker of electing a president. Now, here's the problem. The Democrats win in 56, but barely. But the Republicans are for non-extension. That's their policy, non-extension. And they have absolutely no support in the South, zero. And the Southerners make it clear that if anybody from this crazy party is ever elected president, we're out of here. So the KansasNebraska Act sets the stage for the Civil War by creating overnight, like an atomic bomb, the Republican Party grew up. People say the Republican Party was the third party that grew into a major party. It exploded into a major party literally overnight, literally. And by 1856, it almost elected president. It had congressmen and senators and governors. And if it weren't for a third party that was running around in that era called the Know-Nothings, an anti-immigrant party, Republicans would have been even stronger. But by 1860, they do elect the president with absolutely no Southern support, and the South then says goodbye. So you could see this KansasNebraska Act is the point of no return. It repeals the Missouri Compromise, sets off a firestorm of protest throughout the North. It creates by the end of 1854, the Republicans were the hot item, absolutely the hot item. It put the finishing touches to the party that had been the rival of the Democrats for many years, called the Whigs. That's going to go bye-bye. Many Whigs, like Abraham Lincoln, from the North, would become Republicans by 1858-59. Lincoln had been a lifetime Whig. He was a Whig congressman. He and Henry Clay's sons and all of that turned into the Republican Party. The Democrats eventually disrupted over the KansasNebraska Act. Some Democrats supported it, some didn't. Douglas didn't see any problem with it, but eventually it splits the Democrats. And when the Democrats are split, that's going to mean the Republicans are going to win, and if the Republicans win, that's going to be the Civil War. You see this progression? So not only does this act create the party that's going to cause a Civil War, by eventually splitting the Democrats by 1860, pro-Kansas, anti-Kansas, it's going to assure a Republican victory. All right? Why did Douglas do it? He didn't think it was going to cause any trouble. Logically, it shouldn't have. Should not have. Because there weren't going to be any slaves out there. He was right. In 1860, when we're ready to kill 600,000 of each other over slaves, you know how many slaves there were in Kansas? 10. There were 17 in Nebraska. Who the hell was going to bring a slave into a dangerous area like that? Nobody in his right mind. But we're going to fight over slaves that wouldn't go to where they weren't. Amazing. But we Americans are the smartest people in the world. Absolutely. All right. And also what really aggravated it, since Kansas and eventually Nebraska were going to come in under popular sovereignty, the North and South tried to stack the deck, and the North began shipping people to Kansas, paying their way to go there. The South began doing that. And what happened is a civil war broke out in Kansas. By 1855, there's an unofficial civil war in Kansas. Northerners killing Southerners over slavery, and nobody there owned any what? Slaves. The type of people who went into Kansas were the same type of people that went into California, people who were poor, down on their luck. And if you're poor and down on your luck, you don't own a what? Slave. So even the Southerners who flocked into Kansas, they were the same kind of losers that flocked in from the North. How much more bluntly could I put it? But they're going to be killing each other over slavery, which is not there and would never be there. But we're going to kill each other anyhow. It's fun to shoot. All right? And any time that things calmed down in the North after 1854, or in the, back east, I'm sorry, all you had to do was talk about something going out in Kansas. Hundreds and hundreds of people are going to be killed fighting in this undeclared civil war. A nut named John Brown, you ever hear him? He goes out to Kansas, says, God sent me. God sent him to go out and hack to death 5 Southerners. He spread them spread eagle and cut them into 4 parts. All right, and a nice Christian, I guess Christ told him, go out and do that, John. John was loony. He was a lunatic. But you get nuts like him going out there, right? And I mean, you have all kind of craziness. And Kansas is just a terrible situation. And it eventually the KansasNebraska Act is going to cause civil war. Because anytime something calmed down back east, just talk about what's going on in Kansas. So if you were an agitator in the North or an agitator in the South, you had a direct telegraph line to Kansas. Telegraph us what's going on out there. And we'll print it, we'll exaggerate it. Hey, we'll keep everybody fired up. And that's exactly what happened. Officially, the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina in April of 1861. But don't kid yourself, the first unofficial shots of the Civil War were fired in Kansas in 1855, with Northerners who owned no slaves fighting Southerners who owned no slaves over the principle of slavery, which would never exist in Kansas anyway. I hate to repeat that, but that's how silly it was. Oh, if we could only see. Okay? Fighting a phantom that just wasn't there. All right, and then what happens, what really is the last straw, is the election of 1860. Okay, I'm going to make it. If the Republicans win the election of 1860, there's going to be a civil war. Republicans almost won in 1856, and they seem poised to win in 1860. And that's exactly what happens. Because the Democrats split into 2, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, And the Democrats were the last thing holding the country together. By 1860, churches had split north and south, sororities, fraternities, social clubs, Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist, many churches, everything had split. And the one thing kind of holding the country together was the Democrats. If the Democrats could elect the president in 1860, we could at least postpone the Civil War. That's not going to happen. The Republicans, and I'm going to go faster because I just want to get to the election. The Republicans' leading candidate, everybody expected him to be nominated, was a guy named William Seward, who would eventually become Lincoln's Secretary of State and eventually purchase Alaska. Seward's folly. All right, well, Seward was expected to get the nomination, but he was a little too radical, a little too abrasive, and the Republicans compromised and took Abraham Lincoln. Miss Major used to tell me God sent Lincoln to the Republican Party in 1860. Yeah, God and Seward screwing up. Well, he's on a $5 bill, though, Billy. I said, oh, I see. Yeah, he was there in 1862. All right, you can see that the Republicans easily win in 1860. You're going to have a map in a minute. But they do not carry any southern states. Lincoln doesn't even get any votes in 11 states. 0. Shutout. Ralph Nader time. And then as soon as Lincoln's elected, secession begins. James Buchanan, a Democrat, was still president at that time. I'm going to talk about what he did during the secession crisis. There was one real big attempt to prevent the war, the Crittenden Compromise, which I think could have prevented the Civil War, but Lincoln rejected it. Why? Because of slavery. All right? So you're going to see we're going to be down the path. But here's what happens in 1860. The major candidates were Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans. He carries every free state, including the newly admitted California and Oregon, every free state except part of New Jersey. I won't make a Christie joke. He split New Jersey with Douglas. You're allowed to split electoral votes. It rarely happens, but it did. In 1860, New Jersey gave part of its vote to Lincoln, part to Douglas. But Lincoln carried every free state. He didn't get any votes down here. The Deep South was carried by a guy named John C. Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president. He was the incumbent vice president. Breckinridge eventually became a Confederate general during the war. He carried the Deep South, roughly the states that were popular with Strom Thurmond in 1948, if you remember, George Wallace in 1968, that deep southern Bible Belt type area. There was a third candidate called the Constitutional Union Party that tried desperately just to prevent the war. They didn't write a platform. They said they're going to run this moderate slave owner named John Bell from Tennessee, but he was a compromise guy. They said, all we're talking about is saving the Union by adhering to the Constitution. Constitutional Union. He carried 3 really border states, slave states, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, but they had a strong Union sentiment in them. He carried those states. Poor Douglas, even though he got almost 30% of the popular vote, Douglas only carried Missouri. He carried Missouri and part of New Jersey. That was it. There were the results in 1860. Ooh, Bill, don't go too fast. Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote, but that's misleading because he didn't get any votes where? In the South, anywhere. In 11 states, he got 0, zilch. Nobody even cheated to vote for him. Nobody. If you did, you had an accident, right? Douglas got almost 30% of the vote, but only 12 electoral. Missouri and part of New Jersey. Breckinridge carried the Deep South, and he only got 18%, but 72. And Bell, 13%, but he carried Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And that's ironic. Maybe those states saw something coming because there were a lot of battles fought, ruinous battles in the war in Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. All right, they were 3 of the most ravaged states. Virginia by far the most. All right, even counting Sherman's march. All right, but anyway, so Lincoln wins. He only gets 40%, but popular votes don't matter. Ask Al Gore. In the end, the popular votes don't matter. Oh, God, I'm sorry him and Tipper broke up. I told my wife, remember when Gore was nominated? And they kissed for about 10 minutes? You remember, there's nothing worse than late middle age. It galls me. I always say to I'm serious, I always say to my wife that people that hold hands in public and kiss in public like that are going to get divorced. Don't I say that? And that's the truth. Didn't they get divorced, old Tipper and Al? Okay. Yeah. Something's fishy there. How the hell could you divorce Al Gore? I mean, he must be a lively date. Talk about, he must be exciting. Like, watch, what are we going to do tonight, Al? We're going to watch paint dry. Okay. All right. But anyway, so Lincoln wins. And the Republicans in 1860, for you Republicans, they were the party at this time pro-government. Republicans were, what could the government do to help the country? Not that government governs best, it governs least. That was the Democrats. What was the party saying we should use the government to stimulate the economy? Republicans back here. This 1860 Republican platform that elected Lincoln, in my opinion, was the greatest platform ever written in American history. Period. Period. And every one of these things was carried out. The Republicans in 1860 carried out every promise they made. No other candidate in history ever did that, except Warren Harding in 1920. He promised to do absolutely nothing. And that's... every one of these. Non-extension. Was Lincoln an abolitionist? He was a what? Non-extensionist. He did not become an abolitionist until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and that had so many strings attached it didn't even smell right. The Homestead Act, giving land away in the West for free to encourage the westward movement. Take 160 acres, improve it, sit on it for 4 years or 5, whatever the law would say, and the land is yours. Land for free. Government's going to give you the land. And how are you going to get out there? Well, we're going to build you a what? Transcontinental Railroad. And Lincoln and the Republicans immediately passed money to build the Transcontinental. It immediately started, even though the war was on, and the road was completed in 1869. Every dollar was promoted by Republican Congress. Every dollar. All right? They'd raised the tariff higher. Now that the South was gone, the Republicans wanted higher tariffs on foreign goods coming into America to protect American business. Now that the South was gone, boom, higher tariff. And aid to colleges. For the first time in American history, the federal government would give aid to education, to colleges, the land-grant colleges. Berkeley was our first land-grant college. There are several land-grant colleges in California. At least every state has at least one land-grant college now. Pennsylvania, it's Penn State. All right, almost every state has to have at least one, and the federal government still indirectly supports these colleges. Not completely, but the only thing you're supposed to do is have a major in agriculture and some kind of mechanical arts. Improve yourself otherwise, but have a major in education. You take any land-grant college like Berkeley, Davis, Penn State. I'll guarantee you one of their biggest schools is not the School of Liberal Arts, School of Agriculture. You could get a PhD at Penn State in farming and at Davis. That's almost as dumb as getting a PhD in history. All right. That'd be Al Gore. Hey, honey, what's your major? Farming? Oh, okay, that sounds great, man. Yeah, but I grow marijuana. Oh, okay. All right, so there you go. Now, those were the candidates in 1860 beside Lincoln. And you know, he wasn't exactly handsome. I don't say he's ugly. That's a terrible word, but he was aesthetically challenged. You know that? But there's nothing says you have to be good looking, right? Although Breckinridge, I guess, wasn't bad. All right, but anyway, those were the candidates, Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell, and then, of course, Lincoln. And was there any attempt, as soon as Lincoln was elected, South Carolina seceded? All right? And by the time Lincoln became president on March 4th, 1861, 7 states had seceded. 7 slave states, right? But there were 15 slave states, so 8 were still in the Union. Going to be important on Thursday. 8 were still in the Union. And was there any serious attempt to prevent a war before it started? Yes, there were several workable compromises. And I think the most workable was the Crittenden Compromise, sponsored by a senator from Kentucky named Crittenden, who had 2 sons. You're going to get it. You could guess. One became a Union general, one became a Confederate general. No, Thanksgiving was not a good time in the Crittenden. And I think the Crittenden Compromise was workable. I really do. And had Lincoln foreseen, he rejected it because of the slavery thing, which I'll get into on Thursday. But had Lincoln foreseen what was going to happen, 600,000 Americans plus are going to die in the Civil War. Had Lincoln seen that, he didn't expect the Civil War to last very long if it started. He would have accepted Crittenden. He did not. I wrote a paper on why Lincoln should have accepted Crittenden. All right? He thought if there would be, he thought the South was bluffing, but even if there'd be a war, it'd be 6 months. And maybe a couple thousand professional soldiers would die. That'd be it. Look at that. When I first taught, before Vietnam was really rolling, it was halfway through, I could make this statement in the first college class I ever taught. More Americans died in the Civil War than all the rest of our wars put together. And up until the middle of Vietnam, that was true. You could combine World War II and World War I and not come up to the Civil War. One last thing before I take your questions. We only had 30 million people in the country, 32 million in 1860, 32 million, right? 600,000 died. That's 2% of our population, 2%. We now have over 300 million. If 2% died, 6 million. If something happened in the United States and we lost 6 million people, would we remember it? Should have Lincoln accepted Crittenden? I think it would have been workable. The only argument against it is it would have hurt the slaves. They would have been freed eventually, I said not immediately, but under much better circumstances than they were. If you think the Civil War gave the black people equal rights, you better think again. Think hard again. All right? No way. And that's what Reconstruction is. So on Thursday, I'm going to do the Crittenden Compromise and why Lincoln rejected it. It has to do with slavery, of course, and even though he wasn't an abolitionist. And then we'll go into Reconstruction, and that'll be it. And I want to really, again, I'm sorry I didn't say it yesterday, but thanks a lot. You know how good this makes me feel. And at my age, not much makes me feel good anymore. All right, so thank you.